Tonight was the second College Football Playoff Committee ranking of the 2019 season, and the two biggest questions going into tonight were, how far will Alabama fall after losing to LSU this past Saturday, and how far will Minnesota jump after upsetting Penn State last Saturday? Both questions were answered, and their full rankings were as follows. At number 1, they have the LSU Tigers. Number 2, the Ohio State Buckeyes. Number 3, the Clemson Tigers. Number 4, they have the Georgia Bulldogs. And number 5, the Alabama Crimson Tide. So that was the answer to the first question. Number 6, the Oregon Ducks. Number 7, the Utah Utes. Number 8, Minnesota, the Golden Gophers. The second question of the night answered. Rounding out the top 10 was Penn State at number 9 and Oklahoma at number 10. But the one thing that I'm still confused about, second week in a row where I feel like Baylor gets no respect. Yes, I get that Baylor has skated by the last couple of weeks. They've skated by about 3 times this season. But I feel like Baylor should at least be in the top 10 because they're undefeated at this point. Because Baylor has played a convincing schedule. I mean, they've played Kansas State and Oklahoma State. They've beat them both convincingly. And they are in the top 25. So Baylor has 2 top 25 wins. That is more than Alabama. That is more than Clemson. That is more than Utah. So I feel like Baylor should at least have gotten some more respect. However, if Baylor can beat Oklahoma this weekend, they will get some respect. And Baylor is at number 13, behind 11 Florida and 12 Auburn, behind 2 SEC teams. So what my overall reaction is, I'm a little bit surprised because I did think that Alabama was going to be at number 4. However, with Florida being at number 11 and Notre Dame being at 16, those 2 top 16 wins, I think it boosts up Georgia's resume. So if Georgia were to win out, that could build up their resume to be one of those 4 teams in the discussion. Which, speaking of that, I have 3 scenarios that I wrote out to discuss tonight, and we'll get to those in a little bit. But I want to round out the rest of the top 25. Starting with number 14. Number 14, I have Wisconsin. They have Wisconsin. Number 15, they have Michigan. 16, Notre Dame. 17, Cincinnati. 18, Memphis. Which, Cincinnati and Memphis, that's going to be huge because that will most likely settle the debate. Well, not really debate, but the chance to get to a New Year's 6 bid. So that's going to be the one that settles it. Number 19, Texas. Number 20, Iowa. Number 21, Boise State. Number 22, Oklahoma State. Number 23, Navy. Number 24, Kansas State. And rounding out the committee's top 25 is Appalachian State. So that is the top 25 of the College Football Playoff Committee. So I have 3 scenarios to discuss. So the first scenario, this is realistically the most likelihood. This is the one that's most likely to happen realistically out of all 3 of these scenarios. So here is scenario number 1. If you want to write this down, go on ahead. So scenario number 1 has LSU at 13-0, Ohio State 13-0, and Clemson 13-0. So that is the 3 teams that would finish 13-0 in this scenario. So the big question is, who is number 4? And there is a big pool of teams to discuss in this. Is it going to be Alabama at 11-1? No conference championship, but they would have a convincing victory over Auburn in their top 25. Would it be the Pac-12 champion, Oregon or Utah? One of those 2 is going to win the Pac-12, assuming that both of them win out heading into the Pac-12 championship, and the winner finishes 12-1 with only 1 loss on the season. Oklahoma at 12-1, their only loss is to Kansas State. And Minnesota at 12-1, with their loss being to Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. So that's the big question. Out of those 4 teams in the scenario, you could say 5, but realistically it's going to be 4. Because assuming the Pac-12 champions can only have 1 loss. So out of those 4 teams, who should be number 4 in this scenario? To figure that out, we have to look at the resumes. Let's start off with Alabama. Now, the one thing that's going to go against them is they don't have a conference championship, not even winning the division, no conference championship game appearance. So that may hurt Alabama. But depending on what happens within, Alabama could still get in. And I'll explain why in just a second. Number 12-1 Oklahoma with their 1 loss being to Kansas State. Minnesota with their 1 loss being to Ohio State. That would factor into how bad is it? Is it a field goal game? Is it a game where Minnesota holds Ohio State to their season low and they lose a heartbreaker 17-14 off of a game-winning field goal? Is that how they lose? Or is it one of those games where Ohio State dominates 59-0, just like Ohio State did in 2014 against Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship? Depending on what happens, if it's a game like that, I think any double-digit victory for Ohio State over Minnesota in the Big Ten championship game should disqualify Minnesota from getting that spot. Although Minnesota would have wins over Wisconsin, Iowa, Penn State, I just don't know. You could consider Minnesota being one of those 4, but it's got to depend on that because Ohio State has also beaten Wisconsin this season. Then Ohio State would also have beat Minnesota. So despite Minnesota having those 3 convincing wins, I just don't know. If it's a 14-point game, 21-point game, however, I just don't think a huge loss to Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game will get Minnesota to the college football playoff at that point. And Oklahoma at 12-1. Every single year Oklahoma has their mulligan. And they've already had it this year against Kansas State. And it could easily depend on how Kansas State finishes off the season. Does Kansas State win out? Does Kansas State finish the season with only 3 losses as a 9-3 team? Could they fall into about the 17 or the 18 range for Oklahoma's benefit? Because Oklahoma's resume would be, their best resume would be Texas and potentially Baylor twice. And Oklahoma State in the Bedlam match. That would be their resume. So, this is the big thing. This could be what could get Alabama in over the Pac-12 champion. Utah's 1 loss. Yes, Utah in this scenario, let's just say Utah wins the Pac-12 championship. They have a conference championship. Alabama doesn't. However, Utah's 1 loss is to a, what I would say, mediocre USC team. On a Friday night on the road. That would be their loss. Alabama's 1 loss is to the number 1 team in the country, LSU. I think that is going to be huge for Alabama if it comes down to Alabama versus the Pac-12 champion, I really think it's going to be Alabama. The biggest reason why is because Utah's 1 loss will be to a mediocre USC team, while Alabama's will look a lot better than Utah's 1 loss against the number 1 team in the country, LSU. But if Oregon is the Pac-12 champion, and if it comes down to Alabama and Oregon for that number 4 spot, it's going to go to, I think, Alabama. And here's why. Yes, Oregon will have a Pac-12 championship. They'll have a conference championship for their resume. But what I think the tiebreaker is going to end up being is when you look, Alabama's at 11-1. And Oregon is going to be at 12-1 with a conference championship. Here's what I think is going to get Alabama in. Who's Oregon's 1 loss to? Auburn. And who would Alabama have on their resume if they won out? Auburn. The way I see that, I think that win over Auburn is going to be a huge difference and a huge argument over Oregon because Alabama has that win over Auburn while Oregon doesn't. So I think this scenario, if it came down to those 4 or 5 teams in question, I think Alabama could get it done. Scenario number 2 is as follows. We have an undefeated Ohio State 13-0 and a 13-0 Clemson team undefeated. So the big question is, who will be number 3 and number 4? And here are the teams in question. We have an 11-1 Alabama team. We have Georgia as the SEC champion. We have LSU at 12-1 with their loss being to Georgia. We have the Pac-12 champion, whether it's Oregon or Utah, at 12-1. We have Oklahoma at 12-1, or we have Baylor at 13-0 with a Big 12 championship. And we have Minnesota 12-1 with their loss to Ohio State in the Big 10 championship. And the big question in this scenario, who will be number 3 and who will be number 4? So let's take a look at this. We have Alabama 11-1, no conference championship. We have Georgia as the SEC champion. We have LSU at 12-1 with their loss being to Georgia in the SEC championship. So far, before even getting to the Pac-12, Big 12, and Minnesota, we've got an 11-1 Alabama team, a 12-1 Georgia team with the SEC championship, and we have LSU 12-1, no conference championship, but their loss is to Georgia in the SEC championship game, let's just say by a score of 28-24. And then we're going to have the Pac-12 champion, whether it's Oregon or Utah. And we're going to have Oklahoma at 12-1 or Baylor at 13-0, the Big 12 champion. Then we're going to have Minnesota rounding it out, 12-1 with their loss to Ohio State. Here's what I think the scenario is going to happen. Here's what I think would happen in this scenario. I think you would put Georgia in at number 3 because they have the SEC championship. So then the bigger question is, who is going to get that last spot? I think this is going to be the scenario that leaves Alabama out. Or at least this will be a scenario that leaves Alabama out. Because if it came down to LSU or Alabama or the Pac-12 champion, it's basically what I think is what could potentially not only leave Alabama out, but the Pac-12 champion out. Let's just say it's Oregon in this scenario. Because Utah, even if they won the Pac-12 championship, I think it would be hard to put them in, considering their losses to a mediocre USC team. So I would say Utah would be out in this scenario. And let's just say Oregon wins this Pac-12 championship anyway, so Utah's out anyways. Then you have, let's just say Baylor ends up winning the Big 12 at 13-0. Could they potentially be left out in favor of 2 SEC teams? Now, this is going to be what will really call out the College Football Playoff Committee for potential bias. Because Georgia would be in by winning the SEC championship. Because it's pretty clear that the SEC champion will always be in the College Football Playoff no matter what. Because that conference is a gauntlet. So what's going to leave Alabama, Oregon out of the playoff, despite being a Pac-12 champion, is LSU being at 12-1, with their loss being to Georgia as when they're the SEC champion. Because LSU, they would have a win over Auburn, and they would have a head-to-head win over Alabama. So in this scenario, I could see 2 SEC teams getting in. And I could see the Pac-12 sitting out the College Football Playoff yet again, the Big 12 potentially sitting out the College Football Playoff again, and Minnesota falling short despite a 12-1 season. So that scenario could be one where we get 2 SEC teams in. Now, scenario number 3. This is my favorite one. I think this is the best scenario that I've concocted ever. in all of my time covering the College Football Playoff on this channel. So, the scenario is, this is where complete chaos happens. So we have Clemson sitting at 13-0 as the only undefeated team. So we have LSU at 12-1. We have Georgia as the SEC champion. LSU's one loss is to Georgia in the SEC championship game. Ohio State is sitting at 12-1, and their loss is to Penn State. Now, this information is going to be critical in the next coming seconds. Baylor is 12-1 as the Big 12 champion, with their one loss being to Oklahoma. And Baylor, we're going to assume, gets their one loss back against Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship. So Baylor, a one-loss Big 12 championship team, they avenge their loss against Oklahoma. We have the Pac-12 champion, whether it's Oregon or Utah, sitting at 12-1. We have Alabama at 11-1, one loss to LSU, no conference championship. But here is the kicker in this. We have Penn State in this scenario, 12-1, sitting as the Big Ten champion, with Minnesota's sitting at 12-1, with their loss being to Penn State in this Big Ten championship game. So this could be another scenario that could leave the Crimson Tide out of it. Because what does the committee do now? This could be a scenario where we could see multiple conference champions, multiple one-loss conference champions getting left out of this thing. Because LSU at 12-1, they have the resume right now. Could LSU really afford to lose to Georgia in this SEC championship game? Because we would have Georgia as an SEC champion. We'd have Oregon or Utah as a Pac-12 champion. We would have Baylor as a Big 12 champion with one loss being to Oklahoma. And we have Penn State winning the Big Ten in this scenario with their only loss being to Minnesota. And they avenge their loss in the Big Ten championship game. So in this scenario, does the committee put in Baylor and or Penn State with their one losses in this scenario that they have avenged their sole loss of the season in conference championship weekend? So could this scenario be Clemson 1, Georgia 2, Penn State 3, Baylor 4? This could leave multiple SEC teams out of this, like LSU, who has earned their right as the number one team right now, arguably a lock for the College Football Playoff if they lose to Georgia by one possession. So we could see LSU build up this resume and it all ending up being for nothing based off of what's happening in this scenario. This complete chaos of a scenario with two teams winning their conference championships and avenging their one loss in the regular season all together in the process. Because you have a huge argument here. You've got, in this scenario, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, possibly 9 teams fighting for these last 3 spots. But to make this easier, I probably would eliminate Minnesota in this scenario right away, because they wouldn't have a conference championship to back them up with, despite winning in the regular season. It's hard to beat somebody twice these days, but I just think Minnesota wouldn't quite have the resume compared to a couple teams in this scenario, like LSU and Ohio State. Because just remember, Ohio State's not going to have their conference championship either. Because with their loss being to Penn State, with Penn State winning out 12-1, Penn State has that tiebreaker within that Big Ten division with the head-to-head win over Ohio State. So Ohio State doesn't get the chance to go to the Big Ten championship. So we can eliminate Ohio State in this scenario theoretically. But would the committee still value Ohio State, considering they put Ohio State at number 1 to begin this whole process? But realistically, here's what I think. I think we would eliminate Minnesota. We eliminate the Pac-12 champion in this scenario. We would put in a one-loss Penn State team because they avenged their loss against an undefeated Minnesota team. So assuming that Minnesota is going to be undefeated in this Big Ten championship game. I'm assuming Minnesota will end up being possibly in this top 5, maybe top 6, or right where they're at number 7. Either way, that's going to be a huge resume builder for Penn State. So I could easily see him putting in Penn State in this scenario, Penn State getting in, Georgia getting in as the SEC champ, because it appears to me that the SEC champion is always going to be in the college football playoff because the conference is a gauntlet, as I covered earlier. So what do they do in this scenario? They're going to have to put in potentially either a Pac-12 champion, which they may not necessarily have the resume at this point, considering the Pac-12 isn't the most competitive conference and not necessarily the biggest resume booster. So do you put in a Pac-12 champion that doesn't necessarily have the resume, or do you put in an LSU or an Ohio State with the resume? I think the 4 teams of scenario would be undefeated Clemson, SEC champion Georgia, Big Ten champion Penn State, and I think it would end up being LSU. Despite Baylor having the resume at this point and avenging their loss against Oklahoma, I just think at this point, Baylor is, right now it's telling to me that the committee is not going to value Baylor no matter what happens throughout the end of this season. Because their actions throughout these last 2 weeks has spoken value of what the committee thinks about Baylor. Because it's pretty clear that they show favoritism towards the SEC because they have two SEC championship SEC teams over Baylor who could end up winning the Big 12. So it just shows what they think of Baylor at this point. So in that scenario, I would say Clemson, Penn State, Georgia, and LSU because they have the better resume right now on paper. So in that scenario, I think 2 SEC teams get in. And just like in scenario 2, I think in scenarios 2 and 3, we could get 2 SEC teams in the college football playoff. So that is all I'm going to cover tonight. Thank you for watching this whole thing. I hope you enjoyed the scenarios. I had fun making them. So comment your thoughts down below if you would like. And I will see you pretty soon on my next video. Take care.